My name's Jim Engel. I teach in the Department of English. I teach a course in rhetoric, and I'm chair of the Commencement Parts Committee this year. I wanted to divide this session into three parts. The first part, I'd like to say a few words about composing an address for commencement. The second part, we're going to show a few of the previous addresses at commencement. And the third part, I'd like to talk about actual delivery of the addresses and some of the mechanics involved with good delivery. There's a real challenge to composing a commencement address because many have gone before you, and there are many trite themes that you might be tempted to pick up. There are many quotations about Harvard that have been used tens, scores of times in commencement addresses. There are many comments about Veritas. You can figure out for yourself quite quickly what might seem to be hackneyed or trite. It's important to avoid these. The committee will not react very well to them in selecting addresses. On the other hand, there are speeches which are drawn up which strain for the novel and the recherché, the outlandish, the shocking, the highly idiosyncratic. These in general don't seem to work well either. That is to say, you must find some level between what is the relatively common and trite reflection and what is the truly outlandish or oddball. Now that's a challenge, I think. And it means carefully considering what your subject or theme is. I actually think you need to spend a lot of time on that, unless there's something so pressing to you, some event so clear and obvious in your mind that you absolutely know you must write about it. But then it's how you treat it that matters. Perhaps it was some experience with your classmates in the classroom, outside of the classroom. Then it is a matter of expression. But please give some careful thought to the actual subject matter. It matters a great, great deal. Now let me say a word about the audience. It's about 30,000 people, and many of them live in front of you. And you don't have a script in front of you either. You don't have a podium. All you have is a thin microphone stand. There's nothing between you and that great crowd of people. It's a little disconcerting, a little unsettling. Whoever is selected will get to practice it, but you must realize that you're speaking to an enormous number of people. Now, given the fact that they're all getting Harvard degrees, we can assume a general modicum of intelligence on their part. Why do I mention that? It's very easy in a short address to underestimate your audience's intelligence and to overestimate how much they might know about a particular topic that you know a great deal of. So what I would say is, in composing your address, never underestimate the intelligence of your audience. In other words, they get the point quickly. They understand things pretty quickly. But don't overestimate how much particular knowledge they might have about, say, a discipline you've been studying, or a topic, an issue in law or in biology, something of that nature. You want to attract their attention and you want to hold it. It's not an easy task. So when you're composing, you may help yourself by imagining an audience of 4 people. One is the younger son or daughter of a person getting a degree, a restless teenager in the audience who needs to have their attention held. On the other end, you might have someone sitting up near the front of the Tercentenary Theater who's been to 45 commencements and is an alumna or an alumnus who has, they think, heard it all, but they want to hear something now that will move them. And then in the middle, you have this entire group of parents, of teachers, of all sorts of other individuals associated with the university at almost every rank and stage. So as you're composing, you must think of an audience of great diversity. How are you going to do something that will address the interest of each one? It's a kind of trampoline act. You kind of have to go up high occasionally and then come back down occasionally to keep the attention of these individuals. Another question that is sometimes asked is it okay to give a little bit of a Jeremiad? Is it okay to tell the audience something that you feel they really need to know ethically, morally? Sure, a lot of the addresses do that. But it's pretty important to do it with a certain kind of touch so that they don't feel they're being preached to. They feel that they're being, induced into a different kind of feeling. That's important. Humor, yes, but I would test it out a little on some people before you try it. It's a hard thing to do. Humor is hard in these speeches. And we've occasionally had instances where it even works in rehearsals, but then when you get in front of 30,000 people, for whatever reason, it doesn't quite work as well. Variety. Many of these speeches are various in the way that they are composed. By that I mean their sentence structure, their tone, their references, their use of rhetorical questions, the length of sentences, the degree to which at times they are intellectual, and sometimes very intellectual, and then the degree to which at times they are passionate and deep with feeling and personal conviction. Can you talk about yourself? Of course you can. There's one mode of address which is deeply personal, and it has to do with individual experience at the university. But then somehow it has to be, if not universalized, expanded, broadened out, made to seem pertinent and relevant to others, and not just a story about yourself, a story about your background, a story about your journey. That might be of interest, but it should be of greater interest if you can somehow communicate that that experience that you have had is one that is pertinent in ways to many other people. Literary expression. I would say most of the addresses that are successes at commencement have some kind of literary quality to them. What do I mean by that? They are careful about word choice. They are careful about the rhythm of the sentences. They're careful about how it sounds. Before you submit any speech that you write to the committee, I would like to make a couple of concrete suggestions to you. First, have someone read it aloud to you slowly while you do not look at it at all. That is, hand a friend a copy of the address and have them read it to you in a normal voice, and then have them pause after each sentence so that you can make any notes about it. It is astonishing what we hear in our own writing when we actually have to hear it and when we aren't looking at it ourselves. This is the old way that essays used to be taught in many tutorial systems. You'd go into the tutor and the tutor would take the essay from your hand so you don't have it anymore. And then the tutor would start reading the essay and stop and say, "Do you like that sentence? Is that the best word choice?" And it is astonishing if you do this with a rough draft, how often you see individuals, and it has happened to me as well, squirm because you know what has been heard isn't quite right. There's some ambiguity, or there's repetition, there's some infelicity, or it's clear that the two parts of the sentence should be transposed, or it's clear that a word that was used is ambiguous, or not the right word. So that's one suggestion. Have it read aloud to you while you do not look at it. That's perfectly fine. It gives you a sense of externalizing yourself from the composition and permits you to have a perspective on it that you wouldn't have otherwise. Has anyone here ever done that with things they've written? Has anyone here ever had someone read it to you aloud without you looking at it? One person. All right. Was it a good experience?
Yeah, it's good feedback. I mean, you can find what you did wrong very quickly.
You hear it, yes? You do hear it. So that is one suggestion I would make. The other suggestion I would make is read it aloud yourself and time it. And by that I mean, don't try to squeeze it within a certain time limit, but actually time it as it would be delivered to a crowd that is large. Don't forget, when you're out in Tercentenary Theater, you have to let the voice resonate. It takes just at least a second or two for your voice to get all the way to the Widener Library and behind the rows that are at the side of the library. So that means you have to read it fairly slowly. Why do I say this? Many speeches that are submitted are over length. Some of them are considerably over length. And while they may be good, it rubs the committee a little the wrong way if a speech is 7.5 minutes. It just doesn't work, because then one says, well, what are we going to get rid of? What's the form of it? What's the shape of it actually going to be? So it's important to try to time it. So have it read aloud to you while you don't look at it, and then also read it aloud and actually time it in a realistic way. You'll need to go fairly slowly in order to do that. Those are some general suggestions I have about composing. And I would hope, too, that when you're thinking about submitting now, you begin right now to think. That's wonderful to see so many of you here. You begin to think now about your idea and your composition. Because the longer you incubate it, the chances are the better it will be. Let me stop there about some suggestions for actual composition of the addresses and see if you have any questions about that or thoughts. Yes?
What is the suggested time frame?
I think we're usually going for 5 minutes. And you really can't go much over that. You don't want to, you go 6.5, 7 minutes, we're in trouble. You don't want to keep it at that limit. And it's amazing how many students I've had say, well, I timed that, and it was only 4 minutes and 40 seconds. But when you get up in front of a group, you can't rush through it. It's amazing if it adds only, 10, 15% of the time, next thing you know. And it's delivering a speech very quickly doesn't work. If you listen to really great speech deliveries, whoever they are, they're often only about 180 words a minute, if that. They're quite slow. Why? Because if you deliver a speech quickly, you will lose your audience. If they miss a sentence or a clause, they have to be listening to the next sentence or clause while they're trying to figure out what the previous one was. So inevitably, it's very hard to try to do the two at once, because you don't have a text in front of you, except for the Latin oration, where you have a translation. But that doesn't help very much either, because you're looking down and up and down at the Latin translation. So it's very important to go relatively slowly. Now, writing a composition for oral delivery is somewhat different than writing a composition to be read. And that's something also to keep in mind. You must realize that people are going to hear this, not read it. They will not read it. It will not be in front of them. And that puts a premium on clarity of expression. It also means that you have to be careful about long, compound, complex sentences. Maybe you can carry them off, but if so, you have to be cautious about that kind of complex structure. It's not easy for people to follow. You have to be careful about antecedents and references in whatever you write. Other questions? Yes?
I'm just curious, does everyone who submits a speech get an audition, or some cut before auditioning?
No, usually everyone who submits a speech does not get an audition. And that's because there are many submissions, and then there are 2 auditions. There's one, a first audition, And then there is a second audition for a considerably smaller group of individuals. And from that second audition, the final speakers are selected. So that means all the more reason to spend time on the composition itself, because delivery alone is not going to win the day. It's a combination of delivery and excellence of composition, the two together. You know, when the committee picks compositions for those people to come to the first audition, it's generally not known whether those individuals are naturally good speakers or not. What the evidence is what's on the page. And if what's on the page seems relatively perfunctory or thin or trite or repetitious, then the committee will not pick it. Just that simple, you know. That doesn't happen very often, and some of the decisions aren't easy. But there's a lot of consensus, so everyone in the committee reads the things, and then there's discussion about it. Other questions? Yes?
Is continuance through the process just based on the speech and delivery, or is it also, are there also other characteristics about the person that are taken into account, like their GPA or anything like that?
No.
Okay.
No, this competition is based on what you write, and then, if you're selected for an audition, on how you deliver. But I will say that the most important thing in many ways is what you write. Because when individuals are selected after the first audition or the second audition, there's coaching. And several members of the committee are there to help with delivery. So it's quite remarkable that in past years, some of the people who were selected as finalists had a pretty good delivery, but maybe not astonishingly good. But then by the time the practice and the coaching and the effort was done at commencement day, the delivery was very significantly improved. Most people can become a markedly better public speaker in a very short period of time by eliminating certain bad habits and by focusing on a few things which we'll talk about at the end of the session. There are no other characteristics that are taken into account. This is a competition based on an address written and delivered, pure and simple. Other questions? No, if we did GPA, I mean, no. There are other things for GPA. There are honor societies and law review and all sorts of things. But no, this has nothing to do with that. Yes?
I'm surprised when you said about the 5-minute limit, because most of the videos up there are like 7-8 minutes when I saw them. So I guess they just actually went over.
Well, that's correct. The actual auditions asked to hold things to 5 minutes. So if you see an address that's 8 minutes, it's because of the fact you're up there with a very large number of people and you have to deliver more slowly. You just do. There's no doubt about that. Because you've got to let your voice carry back and forth, and occasionally there are interruptions. Occasionally there's applause or laughter. You don't get that in an audition. And there's a generally a somewhat slower process in front of a huge crowd. There's sort of a rule of thumb about this. You know, the larger a crowd, generally, the slower you have to speak to it. Or, I don't know, is anyone here in an orchestra play music at all? No? We have a musician? We have any musician? Yeah. Well, it's said that if you play, for example, an oratorio with a very small orchestra and a very small choir, it's going to go quite a bit faster than if you do it with a very large orchestra and a very large choir, right? And so there's a kind of similar law in speaking. You speak to a very large number of people in a great space, and they don't have on separate headphones. They've got to wait for all that to come to them. That, I think, must be the explanation why some of these are longer than what we ask for the actual limit. Other questions? Any? Yes?
Should the written speech that's submitted can that be omitted
That's a good question, and I would say it's probably better to include it, actually, just as a matter of course. But no one pays attention to it as such. It's formulaic, that's true. But I think it's not a bad idea to have it there. Don't forget, when you begin this address, that's the way you will begin it. You will address the assembled audience. And there's not an absolute formula that you must use. In other words, you don't have to address the assembly the way the deans do when they present degrees. And they address the president and they address the overseers and so forth. You don't have to go through exactly that kind of formula. But it's very good to have the beginning of an address, have an address, and say something about the individuals to whom you are presenting. Yes.
You've mentioned a committee a few times. Who is that? The senior class committee, or
no? This is a committee of faculty and administrators who are appointed to the commencement parts committee, and they come from different schools, and some of them have been on the committee for a while. They come from different parts of the university, and they all have had experience with commencement speeches before and dealing with them. So that's the committee. It's not centered in one school only. It doesn't have any particular truck. It's got to make a decision on 3 kinds of addresses, which are the graduate English, the undergraduate English, and then the Latin address. Okay? Other questions? Thoughts? Yes?
Are there particular topics or particular ways of framing topics that...
So I'll go again. Are there particular topics or ways of framing topics that are more appropriate to the occasion? So from having a look at a few of the videos, they're very sort of inspirational, what will you do with your Harvard degree type speeches. Do you have any sort of opinions on that?
Well, you probably don't want to turn the audience away feeling depressed. You just don't. Have some speeches had some criticism in them? Yes. Have some speeches that the committee hears are too uplifting. They're nothing but sort of empty aspiration. So I would say the substance matters. Topics, there are many different kinds of topics that have been treated. Small incidents that appear in retrospect very significant, things that happened to someone while they were not at the university that they reflected on while they were here, academic experiences, personal experiences, individual encounters. There's been a great range and a great inventiveness of topics. People have commented on things that they learned in class. People have commented on activities that they pursued, say, in a group or in a school, such as a club. Some people have talked about sports. Some people have talked about music. It doesn't really matter. You do need to think that you're addressing people on a certain occasion. And so to talk about the institution or to talk about experiences at the institution would seem to make sense. On the other hand, there's no particular requirement in terms of topic. I think that would be unfortunate if there were in many ways. You have to have freedom to think and invent. Yes?
Is this distinct from the Harvard oration and the Ivy oration? Is this a separate competition, or are those part of the undergraduate English addresses?
This is a competition for commencement day only. The Morning Exercises in Tercentenary Theater. It has nothing to do with class day. It has nothing to do with any other form of address. So this is where everyone is assembled in the Morning Exercises commencement day, in which people are not given their degrees individually, but they are given their degrees as groups, say as undergraduates or as members of the medical school and the like. And that's where everyone is assembled in Tercentenary Theater, which is that area of the yard between Memorial Church and Widener Library, stretching over to University Hall and Seaver Hall. And people sit all the way up on top of Pusey and all the way back the sides of Widener. So that's competition is only for that, for nothing else. So if you're thinking of, say, class day or senior class, that's completely different, completely different. Yes?
Are there 3 speakers which would be selected, like one for undergraduate, one for Latin, and another for graduate?
Well, there is a Latin address which is undergraduate. There's a graduate English address, and that is anyone from any one of the professional schools or the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, and then there's an undergraduate English address. 3 different addresses. Yeah, 3 different addresses. So for the graduate English address, anyone from any of the professional schools who is getting their degree may compete. Anyone from the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences may also compete in the graduate English address. The undergraduate is for someone in the college. The undergraduate Latin is for someone in the college. Yes?
I'm thinking strategy now. So if you are trying to address a collective, right, would you consider, say, your cohorts, or would you consider the larger crowd? Who would you sway towards when you are trying to address the collective?
In the past, we've had people talk about their classmates in the particular school in which they have studied together. But somehow you have to make that attractive to a larger crowd. It can't be some in-discourse of, say, the Kennedy School or the Ed School or the Divinity School or something like that. It has to be something that can be accessible to others and that is open to others. But, you know, it's possible to have an address in which you talk about something that happened at that particular school with people who are only at that school. But then it somehow has to fan out and be appealing to a larger group. I mean, I think that this kind of address, therefore, differs somewhat for the kind of address you would have at the commencement ceremony of an individual school. So, for example, you might have a student address at the Ed School. Well, this is a little different because it's addressing the entire university. Yes?
How many applications do you tend to feel? Thank you. Look at that. Hi. So how many applications do you tend to receive for the different competitions, specifically like graduate students applying to give the graduate address?
A lot. What did we have last year, Stephen? 100?
North of 100, 125
Yeah.
graduate submissions.
Yeah. Undergraduate submissions slightly under that, and Latin submissions maybe only 10. I mean, there used to be a Hebrew address at commencement, not after 1817, but so the Latin is small, actually more entrance in the graduate English than anything else, generally speaking. So it's a tough competition. And I will say this, there are many fine addresses that are not chosen. That's just a fact. In the end, the committee has to pick one address, and sometimes that's an extraordinarily hard thing to do, and people say, you know, I gave this great address and it wasn't picked, and the answer is, yes, you gave a great address and it wasn't picked, because another address was picked because that was great too, and there might be 3 or 4. Decisions in the end are very, very hard, and no one should go away feeling that somehow they did something wrong or they failed or something like that. I mean, if we had a different kind of commencement, maybe we'd have more addresses, but Shall we watch a few? Shall we take a look?
Do you want to watch Walter Smeltz from the Divinity? Do you remember him?
Sure, I do. We can watch that, but maybe we watch this one too.
Sure, okay.
The poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge was once asked why he attended so many chemistry lectures. He responded that the chemistry lectures improved his stock of metaphors. I'm not a poet. I was a neurobiology concentrator. But I've discovered that in the same way that Coleridge enriched his poetry by studying science, I have deepened my knowledge and appreciation of neurobiology by studying the humanities and the social sciences. In neurobiology, we learn of two fundamental types of cells, our neurons and our glial cells. Neurons are the cells within our brains that allow us to do everything. From walking and running to speaking and listening, these projections form the foundation of human behavior. Our glial cells are a different cell type. They're the glue that holds our neurons together. In many ways, they're the scaffold that provides the brain its structure. A liberal arts education is like our glial cells. Such an education provides the scaffold on which individuals are formed and allowed to develop creativity and innovation in whatever field they choose to study. Going through college, my interest in neurobiology grew, but so too did my interest in Hindu literature and Dutch Renaissance painting. As my curiosity increased, I developed an interconnected consciousness whereby I thought about the subjects I studied, not as disparate fields, but rather as an organic whole, important for obtaining a total picture of reality. One powerful example of this interconnected consciousness at play is in the work of Oliver Sacks. A renowned author and physician, he's been called the poet laureate of modern medicine. In his most recent work, Musicophilia, Oliver Sacks beautifully tells the story of a young woman with epilepsy who is indifferent to music. She's never been moved by it. But when she is placed on a drug to treat her seizures, something happens, and she begins to passionately pursue music, listening to classical radio stations for hours on end. This story brings to life scientific questions which may not have been asked before. How does this drug transform a meaningless distraction into a beloved pastime? Why does it happen in this particular woman and not with others? Harvard professor George Daly is a preeminent stem cell biologist, and in a class he taught this semester, we delved deeply into the science of stem cells. But we also studied the patients who interacted with us in the classroom. Like scientists, like artists, we watched their bodies and their movements, so altered by illness. Like anthropologists, we listened to their narratives about how disease had changed their lives. George Daly and Oliver Sacks place science in the context of human experience. Likewise, current discussions of our healthcare reform weave science and the liberal arts together, connecting the economist who warns that expensive drugs burden our healthcare system, connecting the research scientist who labors day and night to synthesize cheaper generic drugs, connecting the historian who attempts to elucidate how we found ourselves with this system of heavy costs and heavier burdens on our healthcare practitioners. We bring together their perspectives to form a complete picture of our healthcare system. We weave together perspectives across disciplines to form a complete tapestry of our reality. In the words of David DeSnow, E.O. Wilson once argued that the reductionist science will one day correct the unempirical humanities. But though equations may describe our world, we do not experience it through these equations. We do not feel the neurotransmitters in our brains that allow us to remember our mother's voices. Instead, we experience the world through emotions and narrative. We feel joy and we feel sadness. As a neurobiology concentrator, I appreciate and I love science, but I am not defined by it. If I were to take my favorite line from The Tempest and reduce the line to a series of words, a string of letters, a sequence of syllables, the line would lose its meaning. How beauteous mankind is, oh brave new world that has such people in it. Today, let us go forth willing to consider perspectives from all disciplines. Let us reaffirm our commitment to the liberal arts through the development of the general education curriculum. And perhaps Harvard can provide a new generation of undergraduates the ability to read syllables and appreciate the meaning that gives them life.
While Stefan's pulling up another one, observations on that address? What was the pace of delivery? Slow. It was. Was it clear? Could you follow it? Did it have some relatively complex ideas in it? Yes. There weren't any footnotes. Several people were quoted. Were they quoted clearly? Yes. Was it an indication of a broadly educated person? Absolutely. Was it passionate? Quietly so. There are many good qualities about that particular address. Each address is unique. Was there a lot of humor in it? No. That's okay. You don't have to have humor. It was a serious address. It was earnest. But it was also one that moved quite quickly. You notice how quickly it moved? And you notice how it explained things? There are two types of cells. There are neurons and there are glia cells. Everything is laid out, but nothing is dwelt on or repeated. It moves quickly, clearly, and crisply. And then at the end, we have a little advertisement for general education and things like that in the undergraduate program. But she is the embodiment of it. Maybe a better embodiment than the actual prose produced by the Gen Ed program itself. This is quite wonderful. So it's important to consider some of the qualities of that kind of address. Was it intellectual? Yes. But was it pedantic? No, not at all. Very clear. No pedantry in it whatsoever. Here's another one. This is a graduate English address.
To get into Harvard's Widener Library, you first climb a huge, imposing set of steps. After you do that, and you finally enter our most monumental temple of learning, you see another imposing set of steps. And if you're me, you pause, because you're winded. The whole ordeal feels like an architect's heavy-handed attempt to teach some lesson, like, knowledge is hard. Anyway, once you catch your breath, you climb the second set of steps to find, at the top, a Gutenberg Bible. As you probably know, the Gutenberg Bible is the oldest example of a book made with a printing press, a revolutionary information technology. As you probably don't know, I love books. The most exciting part of coming to Harvard, for me, was getting the library card. Because if you love books, this is a good place to be. In fact, I'll tell you how big our collection is here. The librarians aren't even sure how many books we have that are bound in human skin. They think probably just one. But if you don't know how many human-bound books are in your library, you have a lot of books. Of course, I don't just love the physical books, I love what's inside them. In particular, I love literature and sacred texts, like the Gutenberg Bible. So in order to study them, I came to Harvard Divinity School, which turns 200 this year. And I'm glad I did, because it is a magical, kooky place where the people are always friendly and often know a language you've never heard of and sometimes bump into you because they're doing walking meditation. And no matter what you just said, it reminds someone of a line from the mystical poet Rumi. Of course, every part of this university is special. Students from Harvard College and our various graduate and professional schools routinely become leaders in their fields. Nobel-winning physicists, educators, billionaires, poets, politicians, and on and on. Those books I love, many were written by Harvard grads. And we create not just works of literature, but law books, music books, the account books of Fortune 500 companies. And quite a few former students have had history books written about them. For instance, presidents as politically different from one another as George W. Bush and Barack Obama both hold degrees from this university. Regardless of your own political opinions, I think you'll agree that Harvard graduates have a habit of going on to matter to the world, for good and for ill, often at the same time. And that's where the Divinity School comes in. Because though it sits on the edge of campus, I believe it is the university's moral center. In the chemistry lab and the math department, the goal is to solve problems. In the Divinity School, problems are wrestled with, but they are never vanquished. That's because some problems just come with being human, and they need to be confronted again by each generation. No new technology, no printing press or app is going to settle the problem of greed or death or hate. And at the Divinity School, we think about these problems and about how people have dealt with them through the ages and how to do what right we can in the face of all that's wrong. As it happens, that reminds me of a line from Rumi. Sell your cleverness and buy bewilderment. Harvard graduates will change the world, one way or another, because we're clever. But we must be more than that. We must be willing to become bewildered, neither approaching a problem arrogantly, sure that we already know the answer, nor throwing up our hands and walking away. Becoming bewildered means admitting some problems don't have quick fixes. It means learning from our mistakes, learning from the other, learning what it is we can't learn. And those are things Rumi can teach us about. Rumi, an immigrant from what is now Afghanistan to what is now Turkey. An immigrant from the 13th century to our own, a Muslim mystic. Rumi has something immensely valuable to tell us, but we have to listen really hard for it, with humility, and for the rest of our lives. Be proud of what you've accomplished here, but know that it's only the beginning. Earlier, I mentioned the lesson of the Widener steps. Well, after a few years here, I'm sure you'll agree that knowledge is hard. But wisdom is even harder. We'll need both out there, whatever our field of study, because this world is complex and contradictory, and if we aren't bewildered sometimes, we're doing it wrong. But we'll go forth anyway, to change the world and also to be changed by it, to write our own books. Those books may be made of paper or published digitally, or what you leave behind may simply be the legacy of the acts that make up a life. Regardless of their form, your books will be good books if you are willing to be bewildered. If you take on this messy, tragic, lovely world and confront its problems in good faith.
Well, that was an address with a rather serious ethical message, but at times carried very lightly, and again, delivered very slowly, very carefully, certain humor, certain humility, intellectual, yes, in some ways, but more than just intellectual. So there are plenty more videos on the commencement website that you can look at, and I urge you to do that. I did want to spend a little time on speaking. If you have this handout, I'd like to turn to it. I'd like to turn to the side that says Pointers for Public Speaking. It is a lot easier to talk about this than to do it. Presence, posture, and appearance are shockingly important in addresses. It's a good thing that everybody in the commencement addresses has on a gown. They can't dress up in one way or another. But it is said that when audiences are given blind tests of orators, they almost invariably pick the individual who is best dressed. It's astonishing. What is the single greatest predictor of success for graduates of Harvard Business School? Does anyone know? I was told this by a professor of economics who has studied this. Not shoes, though. It's height. The taller someone is, it seems, the more likely they are to succeed by the way the business world measures it. That's a little shocking, isn't it? It seems terribly unfair also. Everybody can have presence. It is important. What do I mean by that? Some people give an address going like this. It's very distracting after a while. Some people clutch a lectern like this and lean over. You sing? Do you?
I play the cello.
Oh, you play the cello. That's a little different. But if you, any singers here? Yeah. How do you have to project your voice? You want to sing sitting down? Is that a good place? No. Shoulders back, from the diaphragm, present yourself. These things seem trivial. They're actually very important. When you begin an address, it is very common for people to begin it by looking down because they're looking at the first words. For goodness sakes, memorize at least the first sentence. You need to look at your audience when you start speaking. If you begin your address by looking down, it's not disrespectful, but it puts people off. This seems so elementary. It's not elementary at all. So many people get up in front of a group and they start to address the group, and the first thing they do is drop their head and present the group with their forehead for the first half sentence or sentence. Don't do it. You're there to talk to people. Make eye contact directly. Even in this huge group, it's good to look people in the eye. It gives you an anchor as well as lets those people know. And if someone says, oh, he or she didn't look me in the eye, well, they know that the speaker's looking someone in the eye. It makes a difference. Speaking is very personal. It is almost as if you're throwing something to someone. Are you a good catcher? All right. Right, okay. That's how you have to do it. You have to pretend that you're actually throwing something to someone. And what's the essence of that? What do you want that person to do? Catch it. You want them to catch it. You want them individually to have it in their hands. And what's the way to make sure that they do that? Make sure you make a good throw, right? You want to catch again? Very good, but harder, right? None of that fancy stuff. It has to be direct and clear. Vary your pitch. Americans in particular have a tendency to speak in a monotone. They just do. And if you speak in a monotone for 5 minutes, no matter what you say, it's going to bore people. It's a fact. Vary your pace. Now, that wasn't done a whole lot in these addresses, but I advise it. Your pace sometimes can be more quick. At other times, slow down. Was there some slowing down at moments in these addresses? Yes, there was. And that slowing down was intentional, and it was for emphasis. And vary your volume. You can, it's hard with a big group, but you can come down almost to a stage whisper. Emphasis. You need to emphasize words. Mark Twain called them the crash words of a sentence. But usually only one in each sentence or one in each independent clause. An independent clause is a subject and a verb in a clause that could stand by itself as a sentence. Only one word, but make sure. So before, let's say you're selected for an audition. Before you come, get your typescript. You don't have to have it memorized for the first audition, okay? That's not required at all. But mark your typescript as if it were a musical score. Mark pauses, underline words to emphasize. Mark where you want to go a little faster or where you want to be a little louder. You know how this is done on a musical score? You know, soft is P for pianissimo, and F for forte. You want to do this, and you say, oh, that's silly. It's not silly. Very great speakers often do this. Churchill did it all the time. He even wrote his addresses not in complete lines, but in the phrases as he would deliver them, with short pauses after each one. Do you notice how these speakers often would pause at the end of a sentence or the end of a paragraph? Pauses never make mistakes if they come at a grammatically correct place. Sometimes people rush too much. Slow down. That's a common fault, is to go too quickly. And you noticed in all of these addresses, did you hear one and? No, you didn't hear one. It's remarkable. What a pleasure it is to listen to someone speak when they don't go yeah, and, or blah, 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 or say right, every 20 seconds. What a pleasure just to hear a direct address from someone without all of those crutches. That's what they are. They are crutches to try to get through. They're completely unnecessary. Most public speaking can be improved markedly just by banishing these. Final advice of the speechwriter for John Kennedy, Ted Sorensen: brevity, clarity, poetry. What does he mean by poetry? He means some kind of illusion or image, something that's unusual, whether it's the reference to Rumi or whether it's combining chemistry with poetry through Samuel Taylor Coleridge, something that is not perfectly literal and humdrum, and gets the audience to thinking in an imaginative kind of way. On the other side is a kind of repetition from another source, The Craft of Effective Public Speaking. And I wanted to call your attention particularly to delivery, where it talks about volume, pitch, and pace, pauses and breaths, articulation. Could you understand every word that those two individuals said? Yes, you could understand every single word. It's not like music lyrics where occasionally it's fine not to understand them. This has to be perfectly audible. Did they drop their voices at the end of sentences? No. All of this again sounds pretty easy, but it isn't. Eye contact, gestures and facial expression, that's a hard one. Some people seem naturally to gesture and talk with their hands in a way that is inseparable from their voice. But you're in front of a large group. Did you notice the gestures of these individuals? Were there many? No. Were there some? Yes. They were sparing. They were meaningful. A century and a half ago, if you were teaching rhetoric, you'd teach lots of gestures. And you'd say you'd have to use them very frequently, and you'd study them. Gestures like this, or like this, or like this. And they were used, very common in old rhetoric. They aren't used now because they seem stilted, and because we're used to people talking on television or on screen, where they aren't as effective. But in front of a group like this, you will eventually need some kind of gesture. I think it really helps. And then the controlling of distracting physical habits or verbal tics, especially this, where one is not, you should be planted Do you notice how the people were planted when they shot from the rear? Feet shoulder width apart, very straight, not ramrod straight, but all of these are aids to very good speaking. I'm going to stop there. I hope you keep these little sheets because they do seem very basic, but actually performing the basics is harder than reading about them. How do you know whether you're doing it or not? You are perfectly in your rights to practice in front of some friends before you come in for the audition. Or even if you have the courage to do it, tape yourself and look at it. How many people here have ever been taped in an actual presentation? Has it helped you self-critically? Yes. Well, if you've never been taped, I would suggest that you might do that before you come in for your audition. It's easy to do these days with cameras and playback. I'm going to stop there and see if there are any more questions. Are there any more questions about anything we've talked about? The process, the committee, the delivery? Yes.
So the actual speech, is it kind of accepted as the package that you receive, or is there editing from the committee?
There are suggestions from the committee. That is to say, the very first draft that you turn in will bear a strong resemblance to what is delivered, but it will not, in all likelihood, be verbatim the same thing. Why? Because the committee likes to help in what they think are good suggestions, not just for the finalists, but for any competitor who's in any of the editions. You know, sometimes if there are repetitions, or occasionally people just mistake a word, they use affect for effect, something like that. The committee is very happy to make suggestions. These things aren't being graded. The idea is to come up with the best possible speech. It doesn't mean that individuals who are given these suggestions have to take them. Sometimes the suggestions are made and they aren't taken. Well, that's okay too. One of the speakers last year, I think, had some suggestions and didn't take them. Okay, they're just made anyway. So I'm very glad to see you here. I hope you all give a lot of thought. I hope you try hard, and I hope that the committee will be reading your addresses when they're submitted. I will stick around for about 5 minutes if you have any individual questions. The sun has come out. There we go. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.